Hi everyone. My name is Pierce. I'm the director of the Transnational Literature Series here at Brookline Booksmith and your host for tonight's conversation. I want to open up the space by saying thank you for coming out tonight. The Booksmith has been around since 1961, and that's because of our wonderful community. Your support means we can keep having events like this, so thank you again. As you may know, tonight's event is part of our ongoing Transnational Literature Series, which focuses on stories of migration, the intersection of politics and literature, and works in translation. If you enjoyed tonight's event, please check out our full events lineup online at brooklinebooksmith.com so you don't miss some of the amazing authors we have coming up this summer, both virtually and in store. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram for updates. Toward the end of the event, we'll leave about 15 minutes or so for an audience Q&A followed by a signing. We have copies of Rivermouth available over at the register. And I'm thrilled to say that tonight's event will also feature a presentation by the Boston Immigration Justice Accompaniment Network. I think that takes care of the business end of things. Now I'd love to tell you a little bit about our guests. Oh, yeah, we can Tonight I have the very great honor and joy of introducing Alejandra Oliva and Ellen Elias-Bursac. Here to discuss and celebrate the release of Rivermouth, Alejandra's stunning new memoir of translation, storytelling, and borders. Alejandra is an essayist, translator, immigrant justice advocate, and embroiderer. She is a recipient of the 2022 Creative Nonfiction Writing Grant, and her writing has been included in Best American Travel Writing 2020, was nominated for a Pushcart Prize, and was honored with an Aspen Summer Words Emerging Writers Fellowship. She was also a fellow at the Yale Whitney Humanities Center in 2022. The Transnational Series team first met Alejandra in September 2020 when she moderated an event for us about translating Spanish with award-winning translators Sophie Hughes and Megan McDowell. Alejandra's grace, curiosity, insightful questions, and whip-smart observations made the event more than we could have imagined, and it remains one of our most popular translation events to date. And when I heard that she was working on a book, I wrote myself a note with a million exclamation points. So I'm thrilled to have her here tonight. And tonight's moderator, Ellen Elias-Bursac, is also beloved here at the Transnational Series, and we're honored that she's been a part of many events in the past. She translates fiction and nonfiction from Bosnian, Croatian, Montenegrin, and Serbian. Currently, she serves as president of the American Literary Translators Association. For 6 years, between 1998 and 2010, she worked in the English translation unit of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague. And she is the author of Translating Evidence and Interpreting Testimony at a War Crimes Tribunal, Working in a Tug of War. I'm so pleased to have them here together in conversation. And now, Alejandra and Ellen.
Thank you so much. Okay, there we go. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. I would like to start out by inviting Susanna from Bijan to come up and talk a little bit about what they do. It's my hope that by having them here, if you leave this event like charged up and ready to do things and get involved in your community, you now know exactly where to turn to. So Susanna, take it away.
Can you hear me? So thank you so much for asking me to speak. As I was just gushing to my new friend sitting there, Bijan is an amazing and productive and unusual network of hundreds and hundreds, nearly 1,000 volunteers who all came together just after 2016 when there was a massive roundup of undocumented people and a massive increase in detentions as a consequence of Trump's policy. And it just started kind of a groundswell. People, there were, in a way, the organization was started by ministers and rabbis and people of faith, sort of faith-based community, reaching out to see what could they possibly do to help. And then it just sort of expanded out from there. And today we have, like I said, hundreds of people, volunteers. And just to give you a sense of the different projects that we work on, we have a toll-free hotline in the ICE detention centers in Massachusetts and in Rhode Island that people who are detained can call to get their needs addressed. We also have a family hotline so their families can call. We provide accompaniment at people's hearings to show support, to explain. Often we have interpreters there so they understand what was happening during their hearings. We also issue letters of support. We provide transportation to ICE check-ins, and we also provide transportation when people are freed on bond or just otherwise freed from detention. There are people available in cars, people arrange for bus trips. It's sort of, transportation is a major point. One big aspect of Bijan is it's a bond fund. So it's part of a national network, and we provide bond funds for people who are allowed to get out of detention. And then the area that I work in is the legal group. We call ourselves legal resources. We are not, some of us are lawyers, but we are not immigration lawyers, but we try to identify what are people's legal remedies, and we try to find lawyers either in non-for-profits that provide legal services or on a low bono, which means a really inexpensive basis. We try to find lawyers who will help people during their asylum process. There's also a group of letter writers who write letters to detained individuals to say, what can we do to help? And we also pay for commissaries so that people can have their basic cleaning or personal care products, but also can make phone calls, which is crucial. We also have a group of people who do interpreting and translating, and I actually was already taking a look at this beautiful book, which is the sort of the theme of that, and that is something that I find very meaningful. A meaningful part of my work is to work as an interpreter, to prepare people for hearings, or to work with lawyers in translating people's stories onto paper and onto legal documents. We also have a very strong activism node, we call them nodes. We participate in things like prison moratorium, no-fee phone calls, driver's licenses, and generally try to improve conditions in ICE prisons while really focusing on the idea of free them all, that people should not be detained in prison for not having the full set of documentation that they need. And I just want to close by mentioning the core values of the organization, which I think we really talk about a lot. I don't know if Alejandra's experience was the same, but in my legal group, we meet once a week, and it always comes up to bear in mind, we honor people's dignity and choices in a system that denies dignity and choice. We expect messiness, confusion, and discomfort, and we choose courage and trust. We judge the system, not people. We fight for one another as family, because we are. Thank you, and if you have any questions, feel free to
Thank you so much. I was involved in Bijan for the short time that I was living here in Boston for grad school, and did court observation with them, and I just found it a really, really moving experience and a way to, like, those values are some that I have carried. So they're a really fantastic organization. There are many different ways that you can get involved, and if you have money but not time, a fantastic way to do it. I'm also part of the National Bail Fund Network. I work with the Midwest Immigration Bond Fund, and getting people out of detention is often a matter of like $3,000, which is a lot to an individual, but not very much to a community. And so giving there is a really good way to just get people out of detention. I thought that I would start out by doing a reading from early on in the book, where I talk about what translation is and like to me. Translation comes from the Latin translatus, to carry across. The word itself implies an edge, a dividing line. To translate means to carry across languages, across borders, across cultures. Translation is something we do with our bodies, something that lives in our blood. Move through our mother tongue into new homes. We sense what the right word or phrase is, not with our minds necessarily, but with some kind of bodily intuition, where shades of meaning dwell. Our bodies are saying, As the word implies, we also use our bodies to carry meaning from one language to another. I've done all kinds of translations, the kind that involve sitting across from someone knee to knee and feeding their words back to them in a different language. Translation of books, of essays and articles for teenagers, of know your rights pamphlets and legal documents, of someone's words well after they've spoken them. It's impossible not to feel what I am translating inside my body. Impossible not to carry it with me from a church basement or a plaza or after I hang up the phone, damp and hot from being pressed next to my ear for an hour. In my translation for asylum seekers, this goes double. Their stories are often ones of violence and disease, stories that pass through me as they pass through language. I can catalog on my own body the places where people have shown me their scars as I've translated their stories, turning into a mirror. Cigarette burns on the back of a carefully manicured hand. The aftermath of surgery that was itself the aftermath of a stabbing. Old bullet scars running cleanly through both ankles. An unset broken leg and the weight on my shoulder of the man who used me as a crutch for a short walk. I don't know in my body what it's like to be hurt in these ways, but I carry a record with me anyways, because it's impossible not to. So much translation and interpretation requires me to pass someone else's language through the first person. Their I becomes my own. Their injuries and experiences enter a language that, for all I am trying to render faithfully as theirs, is in reality only mine. This line of self and not self is like chalk on a blackboard. From far away, the line looks crisp, stark, easy to understand, but as you approach it, as your nose bumps the dusty slate, you understand that the line is not exactly unbroken, that no matter how much you erase, the particles of the chalk that were the line still float through the air. In a sense, as a translator, I do not exist on the page. When I take up the weight of someone else's story by translating it, the thing I carry is a ghost, and the teller is no lighter for my carrying that story alongside them. It's in feeling the weight of the story that I can transmit it to you also, which is why I try. And why I try to erase myself in the process, so that you might read someone else's words that I have translated and be reminded of your mother or your aunt or your sister, your neighbors and friends, forgetting the step in the middle. I aim to become invisible because then this asylum seeker is speaking directly to you, and you have no choice but to listen. Thank you.
Okay, oh, there it is. So I wanted to start by asking you about rivers, because there we have it, Rivermouth, at the title of the book, and it's a very powerful metaphor throughout the book in all sorts of different ways. So if you might just dwell a little bit on sort of ways that rivers play in this, that would be a good way to start, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So the title comes, and the incredible cover that artist Paula de la Calle did, comes from mainly the Rio Grande, also known as the Rio Bravo, if you are on the other side of the border, which is not just a river, but a border. And my grandmother is from Brownsville, Texas, which is right at the tippy-tip edge of Texas, right where the Rivermouth is. And throughout mythology, throughout all of these ideas, we see rivers as this place of growing and of fertility and also of transformation and movement. And if you are looking at a river that is also a border, that is also kind of a divide between these two languages, but also kind of language itself, you get all of these different ideas and all these places of the river not exactly being a line, but being a space of possibility and a space of coming together and of ferment and new things arising from it. And so that's kind of where the title comes from.
Okay, well, one of the other, so I have many thoughts about this book. It's a very rich experience reading it to all of you. But so what was it? This is a terrible question to ask someone who's written a memoir. But what was it like for you writing it? Because it one of the things that's so impressive about it is you give us both your experiences as you're experiencing them, and yet you're analyzing them at the same time. And I've worked at the War Crimes Tribunal. I've translated many novels about war because the part of the world that I've lived in for a long time and translated from went through the 90s. And I don't think that I could pull back and see quite as clearly as you do in the book what it is that's happening to me and how I'm doing it. So I just was wondering what that experience was like.
Yeah, I don't know how clear this is from reading the book itself, but I feel like while the engagements that I had with this work were really intense, they were also often very short little periods of time. So like the trip to Tijuana that the book opens with was a week and a half of time, more or less. And then I got to go home and reflect and rest and be away from it for a little bit. And then when I was working at the asylum clinic, that was once a week on Tuesdays, and I would go and I would go into the church basement and I would talk to people and I would help fill out forms. And then when that was done, I got to ride the train home and go back to my normal life. I was working in publishing at the time, like sending tweets professionally, and got to like not have that be my full-time anything. And all of these experiences that I kind of outline in the book are the result of these sort of very intense kind of brief engagements with this system that I then got to walk away from, that I had this privilege to say, okay, and now I need to rest. And it's rest, I think, that this book was possible, and that is a complicated thing, but also an important thing, and something that more people deserve.
Thank you. That's very interesting. So one of the things you touch on, and again, I'm contrasting it to my experience of translating for a courtroom, where people say terrible things in person or in documents, and it was our job to make sure that those were translated exactly as they were said, with all the vulgarity and dehumanizing and everything that goes with those kinds of war-related documents. But you were struggling over and over again, I'm sure, with this issue of how much to be an advocate, how much to be a translator. And it's very, I learned in the small amount of interpreting that I've done that there you are sitting on a bench at a courtroom or something, and there's the lawyer, and there's you, and there's the person whose issues are being discussed, and they turn to you and say, what do I do now, or something, and you're supposed to turn to the lawyer and say, what do I do now?
Yeah.
You're not supposed to give that person an answer. And so I was really interested in the way you talk about this business of translation and advocacy, and I'm grateful for.
Yes, so I think a lot of my understanding of this issue was stuff that I initially came to out of being in the room and wanting to save people from volunteers, sometimes indelicate questions, or they're being like, you should practice telling your story better. And you're like, oh my God, no, that is not, you should not rehearse your traumatic experience so that it looks good in front of the judge. That is bad. And out of the sense that like, I knew better what this person needed and what they needed to understand out of the situation, and it was later reading, particularly with the work of Roberto Tijerina, who really set it into concrete language and created all of these trainings for interpreters and advocates in social justice settings, where he was like, no, don't do that. People deserve, like, one of Bijan's sort of mottos is that you need to give people choice and you need to give people agency, and the best way to do that is by translating everything in the room, even the indelicate questions, so that later they can say, I don't want to work with that volunteer anymore, and I don't want to be a part of this. And so it's something that I've definitely like grown in through time, but it is such a tricky thing to deal with, of being like, well, I kind of have an idea of what you should do, but I can't give you advice, but I sort of understand what's going on better because I at least speak both these languages, and it's a tricky position to find yourself in.
Well, and you've been dealing with a lot of people faced with, at least in some ways, similar experiences, and so you know this worked another time, and maybe I could suggest that or something like that. It's tricky. One of the things I thought you also did extremely well in this book is discussing what I'll call ego negotiation. So you come in a position of power, and you have English, you have access to English, and you have access to knowledge that those individuals don't have. And let me just say also, that when I was reading the book, I suddenly realized about a third of the way through that the Tijuana material I was reading had all taken place in just 1 week or a little bit more, and I thought, oh my goodness. And it's a strange experience working with each of these individuals briefly, because it's almost like a slideshow of all these people that you're interacting with in greater or lesser depth. And but so here you have this power, and it's a struggle to deal with that. It's a humbling and mastery and all those things at once. And I will read a little passage here because I was so moved by it. And in a way, this passage to me is like a touchstone for why a person would get involved in activism, which is relevant to what we just heard here. I don't know how else to help. Don't know if I'm brave or smart or strong enough, the fear of return, to remake the world into the place it needs to be to make sure everyone is safe. I haven't even figured out how to talk to people in a way that grants them agency, that treats them like real people instead of the fragile aftermath of their own experiences. I don't know if bravery or smarts or strength on an individual or collective level are even capable of fixing this problem. And so, in this question of ego and your personality in that setting, a little bit of, if you can, a little bit about that. The book touches on these things quite a lot.
Yeah, I think that's one of the trickiest things in like any sort of helping situation, of going in and being like, I'm here, I'm gonna help, I'm gonna fix this. And then you show up and then you realize that you are not just in over your head, everyone's in over their heads, and the problem is bigger than you can get your arms around even. And that's both really dispiriting, and also the moment when you, by absolute force, have to look around and be like, okay, who else is in the room with me? Who else is doing this work? Who else is involved in this? And that's sort of where you get that sense of not ego, but like, maybe this is possible because we're all here together. But yeah, it's always I was so overwhelmed. I was in divinity school when I was in Tijuana, and I remember going home one night and calling one of my friends who was more on the chaplaincy track than I was, and I was like, how do you do this? Like, how do you sit with people every day as they are going through things? And she's like, you just do. You sit with them, and you take what they're giving you, and you put it away, and you're gonna take it out later. But for now, you just have to sit there, and you have to listen, and that's it. That's what you can do, and that's what they need from you. They don't need you to fix anything. They just need your space.
So one of the things I learned at the tribunal working there is everybody kept saying, oh, it must be so disturbing working on all these war-related. I was working on documents. I was not an interpreter, but so much disturbing material. And I learned that I could be compassionate and concerned about the material that I read, and yet professional. And there were many days where I could do that. And then there'd be a street name of the street I lived on. Not that I lived on that street, but it was another town, but it had the same name as my street. Or somebody's birthday would come, identified in their birthday would be the birthday of someone I knew. These weird, random things would come along, and suddenly what was happening to them was happening to me. And I wondered if you had that kind of experience too. You talked about names a little bit, hearing the names of members in your family, and I was moved by that because it's exactly the sort of thing I experienced.
Yeah, it's one of those things where the sort of setup in Tijuana is that everyone gets assigned a number, you're standing around in the plaza for your number to be called, a number gets called, they read out the name next to it. And so you can be in conversation with someone else, just chatting, and then suddenly you hear your own name and you're like, yes, who? And it's not you, it's somebody else who happens to be Alejandra. There are literally millions of us in Latin America. But it's weird, and you're like, what? It's not me, and it couldn't be me because of all of these very structural things that have gone in my life. But also it could be, and there's somebody else out there with my same name who also has turned when they hear this word, and whose mother called them probably the same nicknames that my mother called me, that is having these experiences, and that really sort of brings it home in a different way. Yeah.
Well, one of the things I like to ask people when I wrote a book later at an institution like that, I was allowed to survey my colleagues because I didn't want it to just be my own experience. And I knew that if I asked them how to deal with what was difficult at the work, they would just say, oh, you know, drugs and alcohol, and they'd make jokes about it, and I knew I wouldn't get a straight answer. So instead I asked them, what are people undertaking this kind of work? And I thought perhaps I'd ask you that.
That is a good question, and yeah, we are often ready to care for other people in ways that we don't want to admit that we care for ourselves. But I think that rest, the same way that this book was written, was through the ability to rest, to be able to step away from the work, and that's such an immense privilege. There are people for whom navigating these systems is their whole entire life, because it has to be, because they have to get that piece of paper that means that they're safe, because they have to make sure that their family or their parents are safe. And I think that if you are able to take rest, and if you are able to figure out ways to create space in your life where it's not the only thing that you're thinking about, which is really difficult. This was also my full-time job for a while, and sometimes it would feel fine and not stressful, and then other times it would suddenly, everything would sort of come up and overwhelm you, and there is no amount of like translating or interpreting that you can do that will cover everyone. And so sure that you're ready for the next time it is overwhelming, and a way to do that is to step away briefly and just sort of reset yourself. And sometimes that looks like I am going to take a vacation, and sometimes that looks like I am going to go stand in the back of the room and drink a glass of water and take a couple deep breaths and then jump right back in. But I do think that this work would not be possible without not doing the work.
Well, really, I just have one more question, and I was interested, as a person who deals a lot with translation, about the way you work in perspectives from other books that you've read, particularly theorist Kate Briggs, the whole question of biblical translation and so forth. And I wondered, we have endless discussions in the translation community about practical work versus theoretical work, which are getting mitigated now by the number of people coming into literary translation who are coming through Masters of Fine Arts programs, and they're used to reading theory. But the older generation, it's all like, no, I'm a practitioner, I don't do that sort of thing. So I wondered if you could just maybe say a few words about the role that reading theoretical or other perspectives on the work that you were doing played in your own thinking and your sort of processing of the material that you were using.
Yeah, thank you. I think that it was helpful in that good theory, to me at least, is a metaphor about the way that things are working. I think the Kate Briggs particularly is an example that moves through the book a lot. She talks about translation as a table. And it's like a very specific table, the table that Robinson Crusoe built on his island. And he builds it because like he's an Englishman and he has to have a table because like that's where Englishmen eat. And he also builds it because it's familiar and because it feels like home, even though he's on this island. And she sort of starts teasing out the different ways that this metaphor is of translation and belongs to it in all these different ways, and not just because Robinson Crusoe did it, but all the different ways that tables are like translation. And that felt like a useful way to approach my work also. She writes about a joke in there that like tables are the most common metaphor in all of philosophy because everyone's sitting down at a table to write their philosophy. And I was like, I too do my work as a translator at a table, actually. Let me keep going with that. And so it felt like a really useful metaphor to keep thinking about things, it felt like another way to be able to take that step back and say, what was I actually doing? What was the actual thing that was happening in this room while I was like very focused on doing this interpretation and sitting across from this person and listening to them, using the theory felt like a way to sort of take another step back and put another lens on it and see what else I could uncover by looking through that particular lens.
Thank you. Well, those are my questions. If you want to end up by saying something that I haven't covered, please feel free, or we can open it up to the floor.
Would love to take questions from you all.
Hi. So I was lucky enough to have an early version of the book, but you so I've read a little bit, but you mentioned that the book is unapologetically bilingual, and there are a lot of sections where there's just a lot of Spanish, and your approach to it is very much like, if you know, you know, you don't figure out whatever you feel like you need to figure out kind of thing, and I really appreciated that. How did you come to the decision to do that and to not translate all of the Spanish for people rather than just leave some of it as is?
That's a great question. I initially started out glossing a lot more of it, and had kind of done more translations, and then I was getting into sections of the book where I was doing too much Spanish to actually like make that work in any way that made sense, but I like mostly just wanted it to be in Spanish, and my editor was like, stop glossing. And so having his feedback and him being like, you're doing too much, people will get it, and it is in fact useful to replicate the experience of someone who walks into a room and does not understand the language being spoken and does not doesn't have a way to like approach it, and doesn't have the language in the space isn't catered to them. Like, it's important to have also monolingual English readers see that and experience that, even if it's like confined to the pages of a book.
Yeah, so I know that you mentioned that you were in divinity school when you were in Tijuana, and then when you wrote chunks of this book, I think, as well. And obviously faith is like a part of the subheader here. Can you talk a little bit about how, like, I know that translation, a lot of translation theory comes from, like, you know, Christian translation or like larger like biblical study translation. Can you talk a little bit about how like you parsed out like historical translation and the faith-based, like, because I know there's a lot to unpack there as you then move into like trying to deal with all these really big complex themes.
Yeah, part of the reason that faith is such a huge part in the book is because I was in divinity school at the time, like very much the soup that I was swimming in at the time, and the theory that I was reading, the questions that I was discussing in classes, etc. And it also felt really relevant. I was raised super evangelical, moved away from that as I was an adult, and then went to divinity school out of like a scab picking impulse of being like, there's something under here and I should figure out what that is, because, you know, I have a scab and what's that about? And so all of that kind of made its way into the book because it was the things that I was thinking about and the things that I was immersed in, but it was also a lot of the people that I met at the border were talking about their journeys and their experiences in terms of their faith. A lot of the volunteers that I was working with were there as part of faith-based organizations. It was also just a really big part of the work that I was doing, and so it really made sense to bring those two things together to think about also like the theory of religion a little bit more.
How, given that you had that background and you were working with that context and that basis, how do you feel that actually affected the way in which you were translating this material?
Oh, that's a good question. So the thing about, I think, especially super Christian translation theory, or a lot of like the real old stuff when you're getting into like St. Jerome, who first translated the Bible into Latin, is that you are having a lot of debates about the original text. And the fact that the original text is divine. It's the word of God. And so you are privileging that, and you're figuring out, how do we do this in a way that still keeps the holiness of this text intact and the divinity of this text intact. Meanwhile, when you're translating for an asylum seeker, you're like, especially for this form that I'm filling out in the first part of the book, the I-589, which is like the very basic asylum application, it is 150 word boxes of like, do you fear returning to your home country? If so, why? Like, do you fear harm will come to you? And so these people are telling you these really harrowing stories, and then you're like, okay, amazing, thank you so much for telling me that. I'm going to now like chop it up into tiny little pieces and shove it into this box, which is the exact opposite of preserving the divinity of the text. And so for me, it wasn't so much like, how did religious theory or religious translation theories like change how I translated? It was just like, why aren't we thinking about the divinity of the text, the primacy of the experience, the sort of unassailability of these people's experiences and words that they use to talk about themselves. And that was kind of where that came in, I think.
I know that as part of like how you framed up this book, I had the lucky privilege of reading a little bit extra beforehand. There's you bring in sort of how you, as a being raised bilingual, sort of experience between spaces in your family and between spaces like a public and private translation. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that shaped your experience as working. You're a professional translator, that's what you do, and then you also have a private experience in translation.
Yeah, so I grew up in a Spanish-speaking home. My parents did speak English. Another kind of vein that runs through the book is this, is like my parents' biography, essentially, which is they came to the United States when my father was getting his PhD. My father was already a citizenship because his mother was a US citizen. And so a lot of the things that sort of get like glommed onto questions of like identity and immigration experience were not necessarily true of my family, but people still kind of assumed that they were. And we also never really lived in very heavily Latino communities, especially growing up. We lived in Wellesley for a while, to give you an idea of like the kind of place we're talking about. And as a result, Spanish felt like this really intimate language for being at home, for being in family only. And it was kind of through doing this work of interpretation, like it was like, other people speak Spanish, but when you are translating, particularly for people who are wanting to come to safety, who are wanting to sort of reach this place where they can have safety and family, and they're often talking about their families a great deal because like that's why they're here. And speaking Spanish, which was then this language of like intimacy and home and family, was a way to like bring other people into the like safety and warmth of my own childhood, basically, and invite them into those kinds of spaces and being family as well.
That question about faith was already asked. But your last answer actually does make me wonder then about kind of the third word there and what migration means in this book and to you and in your work.
Thank you, that's a great question. So I think most surface level, the book is mostly about my work translating for immigrants and for people who have migrated. And then I think a strain that sort of develops throughout the book is this idea that migration is a human right. Everyone deserves to migrate for whatever reason they want. A lot of the work in the book focuses on people who have quote unquote the right to migrate quote unquote legally because of traumatic or difficult experiences in their past that have to slot into these very specific categories legally in order to actually gain asylum. But they are nevertheless people who said, you know what, my home country is not a safe place for me to be anymore. I am going to exercise my right to migrate. I am going to, you know, I have the political belief that I deserve to be safe, and I am going to put that into action by migrating. And so that is, I think, the other sort of thread that comes through the book.
I had one more thing I was thinking about as I listened to you talking about the various contexts in which you've worked, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the difference between working as a volunteer and working professionally. Not to say that volunteers aren't professional, but if somebody's paying you, there's a relationship involved where they expect certain services from you, and I just wondered how that, if you saw things as being different in those two situations.
Yeah, so a lot of my very explicit sitting down knee to knee across from someone interpretation was done on a volunteer basis. The job that I had up until a couple months ago was doing communications for the National Immigrant Justice Center out of Chicago, which is a legal nonprofit that does a lot of legal work and then also a lot of policy advocacy. And so the translation I was doing there was a lot of documents and a lot of, here's a know your rights information, here is this person. I did a lot of storytelling also, which was really important and exciting to me, which is to say people who had won their immigration cases and wanted to tell people about what had happened and what that experience had been like for them of moving through the immigration system would come, and we would have a conversation, and then I would publish something in English usually, but then also I would translate that as well and put it out in Spanish, because if there's anyone that needs to know what it's like to go through the immigration system and make it out the other side, it's people who are in the middle of that, very often not speaking a ton of English, and kind of trying to bring in a little bit more language justice to the things that we published as an organization. And so there was both a very different form of translation or interpretation that I was engaged in volunteer and sort of professional spheres, but also, yeah, I think that there's a little bit of a different angle or a side as far when money comes into it, and you end up doing the video for the big fundraiser so that all the lawyers can come in and give $10,000 and sponsor your work for a while, and there's that feels complicated and weird sometimes, and you're I don't want to talk to this person. They're not in it, they don't know, and so I think that also there was a little bit of this is not the work that feels vibrant and important, even though it's the work that supports the work that is vibrant and important. So yeah.
Can you expand a little bit on the concept of language justice that you just mentioned? Because I assume it's more than just making sure that stuff is accessible in multiple languages.
Yeah, so language justice is this idea that I first came to through the work of this really cool translation collective called Antena Aire, and they have two branches, kind of one in LA and one in Houston, but they describe language justice as this idea that anyone should be able to walk into the room and feel like their language needs are accepted and accommodated, and that they're able to express themselves in any language that they have and feel heard by the space. And so they talk about it a little bit as publish your stuff in multiple languages. If you are interviewing someone in a language, then publish that so that the person can read it again. But they also talk about it as, make your community meetings language accessible to people. Sometimes that means getting headsets and an interpreter in the back of the room who's translating for people. And I've been in spaces that are like that, and it's incredible the ways that rooms come to consensus and they are able to talk to each other across language and often like racial political divides in order, because they're able to communicate freely and openly and feel heard and understood because they're able to do so in the language that feels most comfortable to them. And so I think that that is sort of the different ways that language justice is talked about or understood, and that I've seen it in action.
I was just wondering, you mentioned also doing some material where you were kind of writing it in both languages, and being in a position where you are creating both of those versions, but you're also trying to kind of include, you know, the context and the needs of two different groups and so forth. I was wondering kind of how you tend to tackle that. Do you kind of write one and actually translate, or do you kind of independently create these two things with that context, or how do you deal with those accessibility issues?
That is a great question. So for something like, for example, a Know Your Rights document, that I think in both languages has to be written in a way where like a 10-year-old can pick up the paper and be like, got it, do not open the door to ICE if they do not show me a warrant that is signed by a judge, and like here's what a warrant looks like. And so those things like that where it's like the accessibility needs are very understood. And generally when you're doing, I think, comms for an organization, you are doing it to have as wide a reach as possible. And like there were some documents, like our policy white papers and stuff, that were not getting translated or interpreted because we weren't sure what kind of an audience there was in Spanish speaking. And like, as with many nonprofits, resources were a question that was active and ongoing. And so things like that where it wasn't really clear that we had an audience in Spanish didn't always get translated. And then for storytelling, I tried to write the English version so that anyone could understand it, and I tried to write the Spanish version so that the person that I was interviewing could understand it. And so sometimes that meant just writing it in Spanish and sending it to them. I have WhatsApped like many paragraphs of text to people. Sometimes it meant reading it aloud into like a voice memo and sending it to folks so that they would be able to hear it if they didn't have like super strong reading skills. And so it depended on the person that I was working with, and then once that material had been created, it was like, yeah, why not throw that voice memo up on the website, or why not throw that that video up, because we made it and it's there, and other people who have that need will be able to access it.
We have so many Spanish speakers coming from different languages to our book. How do you address the cross-cultural communication aspect in the various, shall we say, a meaning of a word within Mexico as opposed to Colombia, Panama?
That's a great question, and one that I've definitely faced, where someone, especially like my Spanish is Spanish that my parents, who are from Mexico and came over in the 1980s, and kind of that is where their level of slang stayed. And so like, if you hear me talk in Spanish, you'll be like, oh, what's that? And so very often, like the easiest thing to do would be like, hey, I don't know what you mean when you say that. I am American and Mexican, and you are going to need to explain that to me. Or like, I am not up on what that word means. Like, can you say more what you mean when you say that? And so just being like very open and honest, and being like, I am not cool, please help.
I love the format of the book. I wonder if you could talk through the way you landed on the river, the table, and the wall. Where did that come from? At what point did you know that was going to be the way you formatted the book?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the three sections of the book are the river, the table, and the wall. And initially I had written them all sort of like crisscrossing, mishmashing, and I was trying to juggle about 80 different storylines and threads all in one narrative. And early feedback from readers was that that was not a good idea. And so I think it became clear after that I needed to find a way to split up these threads and to talk about them in different ways. And I think the way that made the most sense was out of geography. And so when I started that divide, I had I was just planning on talking especially about courtrooms in part 3, and then in December of 2019, I ended up doing a visit to a detention center in Mississippi, and that was a very intense experience, and I feel like I learned a lot. I'd never been inside any kind of like a carceral site at all, and so seeing actually like this is what prison looks like was something that I was like, oh, we don't actually understand this at all. Even if, you know, we've binged Orange is the New Black, you don't actually like realize what it looks like or what it means to have your lights go on at 4 in the morning and turn off at 11 at night. And it felt really important to include that. And so the last section is called The Wall and is a lot less about Trump's wall than the title might suggest, but is about the walls of sort of the carceral system and the immigration state, and that was kind of how that section came together. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming, everyone.